Hey there, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into a really complex and vital topic, the whole diplomatic picture around the Gaza war and the incredibly tough obstacles that seem to stand in the way of any lasting ceasefire.
It really is. It's a situation that's, generated intense reactions worldwide. And for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a few sources, articles, research reports, basically looking at how the world's been responding, what ceasefire proposals have been put out there, and the huge challenges mediators are facing.
Right. So our mission today is really to unpack all that material and pull out the key insights for you. We want to give you a clearer picture of these global diplomatic pushes and, importantly, highlight the core disagreements that, at least according to these sources, are stopping a resolution.
And it's really important to say this up front, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is obviously a highly charged subject. Our goal here is simply to report impartially on what's in these sources. We're just conveying the ideas, the stated positions exactly as we found them in the material. We're not taking sides or endorsing any viewpoint.
Yeah, think of us as just laying out the information, showing you what the different reports and analyses say about the positions taken by the various parties involved.
Okay, great. So let's dig in. What do these sources tell us about those very first international reactions? The early calls for a ceasefire. What was the mood internationally right at the beginning?
Well, right from the start, the sources indicate this immediate high-level alarm. You had, for instance, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, making a direct plea for a ceasefire back on October 24th. He described the situation as a god-awful nightmare.
Strong words from the head of the UN.
Definitely notable language.
Yeah.
And that concern quickly moved to the wider UN structure.
Yeah, the material mentions the UN General Assembly voting on a resolution for an immediate truce. What happened there?
So the sources show a pretty clear message coming from the General Assembly. It was 121 countries voting for that truce resolution. Only 14 against and 44 abstain.
So a big majority early on wanting things to stop.
That vote really highlights, according to the material, a significant international push early on for a halt to the fighting.
But as the sources also make clear, there were immediate roadblocks, right? Different ideas on how to actually get there. What was the U.S. position then, President Biden's stance, as reported?
The material we looked at cites President Biden saying, look, the hostages held by Hamas, they needed to be released first. His argument, as noted in the sources, was that a ceasefire without that condition, it would just let Hamas regroup and potentially attack Israel again.
Okay. And Hamas, how did they respond to these initial calls and positions? What do the sources say about their public messaging at that time?
That's really interesting, actually, because the sources seem to show maybe mixed signals, or at least different voices from within Hamas leadership early on.
How so?
Well, you have Hamas chairman Ismail Haniyeh quoted saying that Hamas was, quote, ready for political negotiations for a two-state solution if Israel agreed to a ceasefire and allowed aid corridors. But then, reportedly the very next day, another Hamas official, Ghazi Hamad, is cited saying Hamas would repeat the October 7th attack until Israel was annihilated. So the sources highlight this, internal contradiction or divergence.
Wow, yeah, stark contrast. And Israel's position on a ceasefire from the start, what do the reports consistently say there?
Prime Minister Netanyahu's stance, as reported, was consistently against a ceasefire unless and until all hostages were released. The material notes that by early November, November 6th specifically, both sides, Israel and Hamas, had rejected ceasefire calls based on the terms being discussed then.
So a clear deadlock on a permanent stop pretty early, but there was that temporary pause, wasn't there? The sources mention a brief truce.
Yes, exactly. The sources detailed a limited truce from November 24th to December 1st, and that period did allow for a significant exchange. 105 hostages released by Hamas, 240 Palestinian prisoners released by Israel.
So it showed something was possible, at least temporarily.
It demonstrated temporary pauses and exchanges could happen, yeah. But the underlying issues, the conditions for a lasting peace, those remained really far apart.
That early phase really does seem to set the scene, showing those tough dynamics and the competing demands. So, moving forward, how did the diplomatic landscape shift according to the sources, particularly around Israel and the U.S., and what was happening at the UN Security Council?
Well, by December 2023, several sources' time, The Guardian, NBC News are mentioned, indicated this growing sense of global isolation around Israel and the U.S. This was apparently driven by intensifying international calls for a ceasefire because of the humanitarian situation.
And we saw this play out at the UN Security Council. The sources mentioned that early closed-door meeting on October 8th, right after the attacks, which couldn't even agree on a statement. That sounds like a bad sign.
Yeah, progress there was clearly slow and difficult, according to these accounts. The UNSC did manage to pass a resolution on November 15th calling for a humanitarian pause. But even that faced pushback. Israel's ambassador reportedly called it disconnected from reality.
Then there was that significant step, highlighted in the sources. On December 6th, the Secretary General invoking Article 99. What exactly does that mean? Why was that important?
Invoking Article 99 is quite rare. The sources explain it lets the Secretary General bring any issue to the Security Council that he believes threatens international peace and security. So it was basically him officially raising the alarm level to the highest degree about Gaza.
And behind the scenes, diplomats were also worried.
That's what some sources suggest. A Financial Times piece is cited, for example, noting concerns among diplomats pushing to delay a full-scale Israeli ground invasion. The goal, as reported, was to try and limit the humanitarian crisis and stop the conflict spreading across the region.
The sources also lay out this whole sequence of vetoes in the Security Council, which really highlights the deep divisions, especially among the permanent members.
Exactly. Those vetoes weren't just procedural moves. They really exposed the fundamental disagreements. Early on, October 16th, a Russian draft calling for a humanitarian ceasefire was rejected. Then, just 2 days later, October 18th, the U.S. vetoed a resolution drafted by Brazil.
And what was the issue with the Brazilian draft? Why did the U.S. veto it?
That draft, according to the sources, condemned the Hamas attack, called for humanitarian pauses, and called on Israel to withdraw its order for civilians in northern Gaza to evacuate south. The U.S. explanation, reportedly, was that more time was needed for diplomacy and, crucially, that the draft didn't sufficiently recognize Israel's right to self-defense.
Okay, and the vetoes kept coming. The sources mention October 25th, China and Russia vetoing a U.S. draft, and then the U.K. and U.S. vetoing a Russian one the same day. It's noted that Hamas actually praised Russia and China's stance then.
Right. And then fast forward quite a bit to March 2024, another U.S. drafted resolution comes up. This one, March 22nd, used the word imperative about an immediate and sustained ceasefire tied to hostage release. But that one also got vetoed by Russia, China, and Algeria this time.
What were the criticisms of that U.S. draft, according to the sources?
Well, reports mentioned the language was a key issue. Using imperative instead of a stronger word like call or demand was seen by some as making the ceasefire conditional on hostage release, maybe not protecting civilians strongly enough. There were also apparently changes made regarding a potential Rafah offensive, with critics saying the final text softened earlier language about it not proceeding. China reportedly cited that as a reason for its veto.
But then, just days later, March 25th, something actually passed. Resolution 2728. What did that one demand, and how did the vote go?
Resolution 2728, as the sources detail it, demanded an immediate ceasefire specifically for the period of Ramadan and also the unconditional release of all hostages, and it passed strongly, 14 votes in favor.
With one abstention, the United States. What was their reasoning, as reported?
The U.S. ambassador explained that while they supported parts of it, they didn't agree with everything in the text. The sources specifically noted the U.S. wanted a condemnation of Hamas included, which wasn't in the final resolution. Algeria's representative, whose country sponsored it, was quoted saying the council was finally shouldering its responsibility after the bloodbath has continued for far too long.
And beyond the Security Council, the sources also mention the UN Human Rights Council taking action.
Yes, briefly. Reports from April 2024 mention Human Rights Council resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire, urging states to prevent forced transfers of Palestinians, and calling for states to stop selling arms to Israel. And then in June 2024, there was a UN inquiry report, mentioned to the sources, that accused both Israeli authorities and Palestinian armed groups of war crimes since October 7th. So scrutiny coming from multiple UN bodies.
That really paints a complex picture at the UN. But the sources also detail a whole range of actions taken by individual countries, too. What stands out there?
The responses were really diverse. Some took quite drastic diplomatic steps. For example, the sources note Bolivia actually severed diplomatic ties with Israel back on October 31st, 2023, citing the attacks on Gaza.
Wow, severing ties. Others didn't go that far but pulled their ambassadors? Which countries did that, and what reasons did the sources mention?
Yeah, quite a few recalled ambassadors. The material lists Chile, Colombia, Jordan, Bahrain, Honduras, Turkey, Chad, South Africa, and Belize. The reasons cited, as noted in the sources, use terms like collective punishment, concerns about the humanitarian catastrophe, or alleged violations of international humanitarian law.
There were also some mentions of economic actions, though maybe not fully carried through.
That's right. The sources mention Bahrain's National Assembly deciding to cut economic ties, but then a Reuters source apparently indicated that didn't seem to have actually been implemented. Turkey recalled its ambassador, President Erdogan, cut contact with Netanyahu, but sources also noted criticism that Turkey kept up economic and military ties for a while before finally bringing in export restrictions in April 2024.
And South Africa took some pretty prominent actions, didn't they?
They did. South Africa recalled its whole diplomatic mission. Its officials were very critical publicly of Israel's ambassador. Then Israel recalled its own ambassador from South Africa. This all happened before a vote in the South African parliament that supported suspending ties and closing the Israeli embassy.
Looking more broadly, what other kinds of reactions did the sources highlight?
Just a real spectrum. You had Cuba noted for condemning genocide. Malaysia refused to condemn Hamas and banned Israeli ships and passports. The Maldives later banned Israeli passports too. Indonesia reportedly appealed directly to President Biden to stop atrocities. Libya called for cutting ties with Israel supporters. But then on the other side, sources note countries like Benin and Burundi voted against condemning Hamas at the UN. So really all over the map globally based on this material.
Okay, this is really interesting. Alongside all these reactions, the sources also highlight a parallel diplomatic track gaining steam, the push for Palestinian statehood recognition.
Yes, that's a significant development tracked in the sources. Several European countries decided that recognizing a Palestinian state could be a path towards peace. Spain, Norway, and Ireland formally did so by May 2024, and Slovenia followed in June 2024.
And others were considering it or discussing the implications?
Reports cited France's President Macron saying recognition isn't a taboo for France. And there were mentions of talks within the EU about possible consequences for member states depending on their stance on a peace plan. Jamaica and Armenia also recognized Palestine in April and June 2024, respectively.
But this international movement towards recognition seems to run headlong into opposition from Israeli leadership, according to the sources.
Absolutely. Prime Minister Netanyahu is consistently reported as opposing a Palestinian state in any post-war arrangement. The sources mention him actively lobbying against recognition efforts and even stating his intent to bring legislation to formally reject such calls. Israel's energy minister is also cited opposing it. This is a fundamental clash, a major diplomatic hurdle highlighted in the material.
And related to that, what's the position of the Arab states, according to the sources? How do they connect the dots between post-war Gaza, normalization with Israel, and statehood?
The sources are quite clear on this. Key Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, link both the future governance of Gaza and any potential normalization of relations with Israel directly to tangible progress towards a Palestinian state. Saudi Foreign Minister Fazl bin Farhan Al Saud is cited stating this clearly, and reports describe U.S. officials discussing plans with Arab nations where this linkage is central.
So the Arab position is really pivotal for any wider deal.
It seems to be presented that way in the sources, yes, a key factor.
Okay, so we have this incredibly complex diplomatic scene, diverse global reactions, the statehood push. But let's bring it back to the core issue. What do the sources pinpoint as the main obstacles, the things really preventing a ceasefire deal from happening?
The sources are pretty consistent here. They really emphasize this deep, fundamental lack of trust between Israel and Hamas, coupled with starkly different, maybe even mutually exclusive core demands. This seems to be the main hurdle, despite all the mediation efforts by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt.
Let's break those down. What are Israel's key demands or positions identified in the sources as roadblocks?
Well, a primary objective for Israel, repeatedly stated by Netanyahu according to the sources, is the complete destruction of Hamas's military and governing capacity, ensuring it can't pose a threat again. That goal itself is a massive obstacle, given Hamas's demands.
Right, and specific security demands, too.
Yes. The sources note Israel insists on maintaining a long-term security presence in certain strategic areas of Gaza.
Which areas specifically?
The Philadelphia corridor is mentioned. That's the narrow strip along the Gaza-Egypt border. Israel reportedly sees control there as vital to stop weapons smuggling. Also, the Netzarim corridor, which basically cuts across central Gaza, reportedly for inspecting people moving north and maintaining military access.
And what about who governs Gaza afterwards?
Sources indicate Israel opposes either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority ruling Gaza in the future. Netanyahu's vision, as reported, seems to be Israel keeping overall security control indefinitely while maybe delegating civilian administration to some independent Palestinians, though the sources add that finding volunteers for that has reportedly been unsuccessful. And, of course, the consistent opposition to Palestinian statehood we already discussed.
Okay, that's the Israeli side, according to the sources. Now, what about Hamas? What are their key demands identified as obstacles?
For Hamas, a major point reported is linking the release of Israeli hostages to the release of all Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. That's a huge demand, reportedly coming from their leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar.
And regarding the fighting itself?
They demand a permanent ceasefire and a complete withdrawal of all Israeli forces from Gaza. That permanence is key. The sources also highlight their demand that displaced civilians must be allowed to return to their homes in northern Gaza.
And the blockade, that's another major Hamas demand mentioned in the sources.
Exactly. Hamas is demanding the lifting of the blockade that's been in place since 2007. They argue it's essential for rebuilding Gaza. But the sources also point out Israel's deep concern here, that lifting the blockade would just allow Hamas to claim victory and, crucially, rebuild its military strength. So that's a fundamental disagreement.
These clashing demands obviously lead to completely different ideas about what Gaza should look like after the war.
Precisely. The sources describe the Biden administration pushing for a reformed Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza, backed by Arab states, potentially linked to Saudi normalization with Israel, but only if there's a clear pathway to a Palestinian state.
But Israel rejects that vision.
That's what the sources clearly state. Israel rejects that model, including any role for the PA in Gaza. So that difference in vision between the U.S. Arab states and Israel is another massive hurdle for the diplomats.
It really sounds like trying to fit square pegs into round holes based on these reported demands.
It does seem incredibly difficult, although it's worth noting a couple nuances mentioned. One source reported Hamas showed some flexibility maybe on the timing of an Israeli withdrawal, and another report mentioned Hamas agreed late last year to an Egyptian idea for independence to govern under PA oversight, though the PA itself apparently hasn't accepted that yet. So maybe tiny movements on the edges, but the core issues seem locked.
So this deep dive, pulling together what these different sources report on the diplomatic efforts, it really reveals a deeply challenging situation. The core problem highlighted in this material seems to be navigating that profound lack of trust and these fundamentally opposing demands: security, governance, the future of the Palestinians, all playing out against that backdrop of diverse global reactions we talked about.
Yeah, the critical sticking points, just summarizing what we found in these sources, seem to be the nature of the ceasefire itself, temporary pause or permanent end, the terms of any hostage prisoner exchange, who gets released and when, Israel's insistence on long-term security control in those corridors, Hamas's demand to lift the blockade, and fundamentally those clashing visions for who governs Gaza and whether a Palestinian state is part of the future or not.
It's a significant diplomatic stalemate that these reports outline. So given this wide range of international responses we've seen and these obstacles that the sources detail, obstacles that seem almost insurmountable right now, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. What does this whole situation, this deadlock, reveal about the sheer difficulty of achieving peace in conflicts with such deep roots? And what might it imply for how effective international intervention can be in the future?
Definitely something to think about.
That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for exploring this complex topic with us.